Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder when I drop my kid off at school and deliver an episode to you while I walk home. I'm Brendan Riley. Well, good morning, listeners. It is a crisp February 19th. The sun is a hazy ball in the sky behind a thin layer of clouds. Google Home tells me it's 16 degrees out, so my nose is adequately tingly, and my son is mad at me because I scolded him for not having found his hat and gloves in a timely fashion this morning. So, not my favorite kind of parenting moment, but I think I handled it okay, even though he was quite a grump. So, victory me. I hope that everyone is doing well. We had a pleasant 3-day weekend around our place. Because Monday was President's Day, the kids had school off. My wife was not teaching, so I did not work either. And we all did fun family stuff. We saw the second Lego movie, which was fine. Not as good as the first one, but how could it be? We played quite a few games. On Saturday, I knocked 4 plays off my 10 for 10. And yesterday, I knocked 2 more off my 10 for 10. So that was good. I am now in the position of having to cheat my 10 for 10 a little bit because I consider Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective a single big game. That the three different box sets are all part of the same game. It's the same thing, it's just more versions. They're expansions. So I consider them one game. On my 10 for 10 this year is the second box set of that, and we've now finished it after 6 games because we played the first 4 last year. Which means that for me to finish the 10 for 10 in my board game stats app, I'm going to have to keep logging it as the Jack the Ripper game, even though I'm playing the Carlton House one. It's going to be weird, but whatever. It'll be fine. My stats will be a little weird, but I know what I'm doing. Probably I should have never switched to the Jack the Ripper one. I should have just kept logging everything as Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective and made notes when I was playing the other versions, but I actually don't have the blue set yet. I'm going to have to get that sometime in the future. So, looking forward to picking that up. We do have a number of other detective games to play first, but the Sherlock Holmes one is on the 10 for 10, so I definitely need to do that before the end of the year. The Jack the Ripper cases were not my favorite. They weren't as well written as some of the others, and frankly, one of the locations that Holmes visits in the 4th case isn't in the phone book, nor is it mentioned in anything anywhere as far as we can find. So we were not clear how he knew to go there. It's very frustrating. I guess it's possible that I missed something somewhere. Maybe there's something in the rule book that would establish that. But as far as we can tell, we did everything properly, and there was just this key location that we just didn't go to. So it was fun, but not as good as I was hoping. The 6 cases, other than the Jack the Ripper ones in that box set, are all pretty good. And we had a good time with those. But the original one, no thank you. Or those first 4, I wouldn't mind not doing. So, okay. So that was Sherlock Holmes. All right. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about rule books. Preparing for Toggle Gaming tonight, I am going to be playing the Martin Wallace game, A Handful of Stars, which goes toward pulling a game off my shelf of opportunity, goes toward trying to get all my Martin Wallace games played goal, although that's not one of my goals for this year. I also have a friend who is working on an area control game that involves cards, and I said, this sort of reminds me of some of the Martin Wallace games, like Mythotopia or A Few Acres of Snow. And he's like, I've never played any of those. It's like, well, I have A Handful of Stars and I haven't played it either. You want to give that a try? And he said, sure. So, preparing to play that this weekend, I did a number of things. I read through the rulebook twice. I set up a game and played about an hour and a half of 3-player to try to get the sense of how it worked. Then I went on Board Game Geek and I read roughly 60 to 70 threads about rules and skimmed another 100. Yeah, there were almost 200 threads on Board Game Geek in the Handful of Stars forum, which is a game that got a very limited print run And so I think that what we're seeing there is the effect of what you might call the tree frog effect, which is that Martin Wallace had a game company called Tree Frog Games, and he produced a number of really interesting games with really neat mechanisms that are really fun to play, but with terrible rule books that take a lot of work to get through and often result in big Q&A sections in the forums because they have problems. Now, as a game designer, rule books are one of the things that I am least willing or interested in going to pay someone else to do. I'm an English professor by trade. I teach professional and technical writing, sometimes more professional than technical writing. I would have to work a little bit before I was willing to sit down in a tech writing course, but it's certainly in my wheelhouse. And so I feel like I should be able to write a good rule book. I would also say I've gotten a number of really positive feedbacks from other people when I've offered to read their rule books. I've done that for a number of games now, where I do a very thorough proofread of their rules and add a bunch of comments that ask questions that help them clarify elements of the rules. But there's always a problem when you're writing a rule book and they say, like, the designer should never write the rule book for their own game because they can't see the gaps. They know the game too well, and it's difficult or impossible to see the places where there's a cognitive gap between what you're saying and what the reader might get out of it. And I will say, as much as I am really looking forward to Handful of Stars, and I'm excited to play it, I'm glad I did as much prep as I did, because there's an awful lot of rules I had to look up or try to figure out on the fly when I set the game up. If I had just read the rule book and then went into play, there are a bunch of things that are not visible from the rule book that are problems in terms of understanding how the game works that you don't get until you have the game set up. And then you're like, wait, how does this work again? I don't understand. I also found a couple variant suggestions from people that I think make a lot of sense, so we're going to be doing some of that as well. So I wanted to talk about 4 different kinds of rules that I see in A Handful of Stars, and ways that they're presented in the rule book, and ways that, as you're writing a rule book, you should think about. On the off chance that Martin Wallace hears this, Mr. Wallace, I am a huge fan and really excited every time I hear a new game's coming out from you, and I hope that you could take this in the spirit of a budding game designer to a seasoned one trying to figure out how to do my craft better. And I apologize if this critique is a little harsh, but I suspect when there's 200 threads on Board Game Geek asking for clarifications on the rules, okay, it's more like 90, but still, that you recognize the rules aren't as tight as they could be, at least as a document. So, I wanted to start with something I think that all 3 of these games, A Few Acres of Snow, Mythotopia, and A Handful of Stars, could do better in their rulebooks, and that's to clarify non-intuitive rules. So all 3 of these games fall into the genre of deck building. They're deck building with area control on a board. That's their kind of the broad category summaries. Well, one of the things I think, if you're making a game that falls into a category that's well established, and your game violates some of the basic rules of that category, you need to call out those differences in big, bold letters. Because on some level, you have to assume that your players think a game works in a certain way. And if it doesn't, you need to say so. In particular, I think there are 2 aspects of all 3 of these Martin Wallace deck builder games that just don't function the way that you would expect them to. So the first of these has to do with what happens when you play a card. In many deck builders, when you play a card, you're sort of building up income. Think about Dominion, or think about Marvel Legendary. In these games, when you play a card, you're sort of adding to your currency. And then you can spend that currency anytime during the round. And then at the end of the round, all that currency is lost. So Marvel Legendary, you play a card that gets you a recruitment point and a card that gets you a slash, and you have one of each of those. And then you play another card that has each of those, and you have 2 of each of those now. You can go to the shop and buy a 2-point person and do 2 points of damage, or whatever. Well, in the Martin Wallace deck building games, you can only ever use a card for one thing. So if you have a card that has 1 movement, so in A Handful of Stars, 1 movement, 1 population, 1 matter, and 1 resource, which are the 4 different currencies, or things that you can use to pay for an action. you can only use that card to do one of those things, not all four. If you have an action that needs one population and one matter, you have to use two different cards, even though that one card has one of each on it. That is counterintuitive if you've played deck builders before. The second thing I think that needs to be called out, again, it's non-intuitive, is at the end of your turn in the Martin Wallace games, you draw back up to your hand size, but you keep the cards you have in your hand. You also only get to take 2 actions. Many deck builders, you can take as many actions as you want, then you discard whatever's left in your hand, then you draw a new hand. In these games, you can only take 2 actions on a turn. You can only spend cards needed to pay for that action. You can't overspend. And then you draw back up at the end of your turn. You can use one of your actions to discard cards if you want, but then you're just wasting that action. So first thing I think a rulebook should do, if it's in a particular kind of game space, it should call out non-intuitive rules for people who play those. So then the rest of these, I think, are elements of different aspects of game design. And I haven't even played A Handful of Stars yet. I've only played it against myself. But I read, like I said, all these threads on Board Game Geek, and so I'm kind of extrapolating here. I might be wrong about some of this. Probably am. There are 2 rules in the rulebook that I think are not as helpful as they could be, and I would call these implied rules. So in A Handful of Stars, you have these things called development counters, and it says when you flip a development counter, you get to use the resource on it. And then when you draw back up, you flip those development counters back face up. Well, there's 2 aspects of that are confusing. One, there are some development counters that you don't flip. Like the point ones or the ones that add to your reserve. I know that doesn't mean anything to you listeners, but there are some development counters that you don't flip. The game does not articulate that. You just have to kind of intuit that. There are some development counters that you do flip to pay for actions, and then you flip them back. The game, it does sort of mention this here and there, but it's very sketchy or very unclear about how that flipping would work. And once again, that you can only use one of the symbols on the tile when you flip it. The main way that I came to understand that you get to flip those tiles at all is that when you shuffle your deck, you get to flip all your tiles face up again, which led me to ask, wait a second, how did they get flipped face down? And that kind of led me down the rabbit hole to understand how those work. So that's kind of an implied rule. The other implied rule is the reserve cards. When you put cards into your reserve, some of the cards do something while they're in the reserve, and only while they're in the reserve. They only do that thing while they're in the reserve. And this, again, it's implied in one spot in the rulebook. It says, when this kind of card is in the reserve, it provides a lasting effect. The first time I played the game by myself, I actually was playing those cards to get that effect. Because all the other cards, you play them to get that effect. I thought you could play them directly from the reserve, but you still had to play them. The rule is implied that as long as they're there, they provide the lasting effect. It's only explicitly said once that these cards provide a lasting effect while they're in your reserve, but it doesn't say must be in your reserve to provide that effect, or you don't play them. None of that's there. It's just implied. So again, that's a secondary implied rule. Another corollary that goes with both of these actually, as well as the reserve thing, is what I would call once mentioned rules. It's difficult when you're writing a rule book because you're balancing between not being too repetitive and wanting to save space, or not being too repetitive and wanting to save space on one side and wanting to be clear on the other and not have people miss important rules. I'd say one of the things about these rule books that's most frustrating, A Study in Emerald is a nightmare this way, is that there's all these little aspects of the rules that are just mentioned in one place. Like I was just talking about with the development counters, I think there's 2 spots in the rules that when you read them both, you understand how the development counters work. But the game never really explains how they work. You have to kind of figure out how they work based on the rules around them. And that part is particularly frustrating. Or figuring out like the fact that some of the development counters just don't flip. The way you know they don't flip is there's nothing in the game that would let you flip them. It doesn't say these ones don't flip, just leave them face up the whole time. Instead, you wonder like, okay, so this one that gives me 2 points, is that just 2 points for the game? Or can I flip it at some point to get 2 points every time I flip it? That's not clear. And in fact, that was established in the forums. I figured it out, but that was established in the forums. The once mentioned rule that I found most frustrating was the cards that go in your reserve are played face up. And there's just one spot that says that in the rule book, and there's one spot that says it on the player board. So if you miss that one spot, then you're left wondering, well, wait, all the cards go face up? I don't understand. And especially because some of the cards, like I said, they get bonuses when they're in your reserve. So then you're left like, do you reveal them when you're using that bonus? But no, they're all face up all the time. But again, you have to figure that out. It's not 100% obvious. And the last thing I wanted to mention as a final thing is what I would call under-tested rules. I mean, one of the things of all of these games, it feels like the rule books didn't adequately blind playtest. And the reason I'm intuiting that is that blind playtesting is the place where the rule book lives or dies. If people can't figure out the game from blind playtests, you know you have a problem. Well, I have trouble believing that Wallace did much blind playtesting with these rule books because I can't figure out the game from them, or I can't figure out there's a bunch of questions I have based on my play. Even just one practice play. I haven't even played the real game yet. And so a blind playtest should have yielded all those questions. It should have demanded revisions to the rulebook that just aren't there. That suggests they were undertested. But one of the rules that came up that actually became a ruling that he made that changed the way the game works is what I call the turnaround rule. So he had in place this rule so that if you go to an alien world, and it turns out the alien world is very powerful, you can retreat without losing any points or troops. And some people had figured out that, but the way the rule is written, it said, if you go into a battle, you can then decide not to fight and you can retreat. Some people were using this as a way to get free movement. They would move a whole bunch of ships into a place where there was going to be a battle and then retreat before the battle started, but they would retreat the other direction. So there were a couple of suggestions about how to solve this problem. One of the suggestions was, well, maybe the fleet should have to retreat back to where it came from. That's one solution. The other solution is the one I'm going to go with. Just that and actually the one he officially ruled, you can only do that retreat maneuver if there's an alien token there, an unrevealed alien token. That's the only time you get to do that retreat maneuver. Otherwise, if you're going in for the attack, you have to attack. The defender can retreat, but the attacker is stuck. So that's the undertested rule that resulted in some people. I'd say the other one, and the one I'm thinking about house ruling, although I'll talk to my folks, is that free action cards should not be discarded till the end of the turn. And this is just to prevent people from using free action cards and a small deck to build an unending turn cycle where they're just cycling their whole deck over and over again in the same turn by using free actions. And so any card that's a free action, you shouldn't get to put it back in your deck until the end of your turn. So that at least you can't use the same card more than once to do something. So that's a rule I'm going to put in place as well. Just because it sounds counter fun to have someone build an engine like that, which is something deck building fans do. So like I said, all of this isn't to call out a handful of stars. I'm sure it's going to be a fantastic game and I can't wait to play it, as has been true of every one of these games I've played. But I'm learning a lot from analyzing the rulebook carefully, and I wanted to share that today with you. So I hope that was pleasurable for you. If you're working on a rulebook or thinking about how you engage rulebooks, what is something you've spotted in a rulebook that you found frustrating, and why do you think it was the way it was? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, so I can learn to be a better rulebook writer. Pop over to Guild 3269 on Board Game Geek to share your thoughts with us on that. or any other comments you have about the show. Thanks for listening. I hope your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.